Step into the velvet darkness of a story well told, where the shadows are deep and the emotions are even deeper than before. We bring you the smooth, cinematic narratives that explore the quiet and beautiful mysteries of the soul. Click subscribe now and lose yourself in our shadows. The call came at 10 past midnight on a Tuesday in February. I know the exact time because I'd been awake already, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and a crossword I couldn't focus on. The winter had been hard that year, the kind of February that settles into your bones and makes you feel every one of your 64 years. When my phone lit up with the name of Street, Joseph's General, I already knew something was wrong. Hospitals don't call in the middle of the night to tell you everything is fine. Mr. Calloway, this is the nurse's station at Street Joseph's. Your daughter Claire was brought in by ambulance about an hour ago. She's in surgery right now. We'd ask that you come as soon as you can. I asked what happened. The woman on the other end was careful, measured in a way that I'd learned to recognize in my 31 years as a high school principal, the voice of someone choosing words deliberately, leaving certain things unsaid. She told me there had been an accident at home. She told me my daughter was stable but serious. She told me the doctor would explain everything when I arrived. I was in my truck and on the highway before I'd finished buttoning my coat. The drive from Perry Sound to Barrie is just under 2 hours on a clear night. That night the roads were iced and the wind was pushing snow sideways across the 400. I drove with both hands gripping the wheel and my mind somewhere I couldn't control. My daughter had called me 4 days earlier. She'd sounded tired, which wasn't unusual lately. She always sounded tired. Had for almost a year now. I'd told myself it was the stress of raising 2 young kids, of running a household while my son-in-law worked his long hours. I'd told myself she was just adjusting to things. I'd told myself a lot of comfortable lies, and I'd been grateful for every single one of them. The hospital parking lot was half empty, and orange, under the security lights. I found the emergency entrance and pushed through the doors into that particular kind of silence that hospitals have late at night, that antiseptic quiet that sits on you like weight. I told the woman at the desk my daughter's name. She made a call, typed something, and pointed me toward the elevators. My son-in-law was already there. He was sitting in the surgical waiting room in a chair near the window, wearing a down jacket still half-zipped, like he'd dressed quickly. He stood when he saw me, and I noticed his eyes were dry. Red around the rims, but dry. He held out his hand, and I shook it because I didn't know what else to do. "What happened?" I asked. He said she'd fallen. He said she'd been coming downstairs in the dark and had lost her footing somewhere near the top. He said when he found her at the bottom, she was already unconscious, that he'd called 911 right away, that the paramedics had been there within 8 minutes. He told me this with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes somewhere behind my shoulder, and everything he said was factually plausible, and none of it felt true. I sat down 3 chairs away from him. We didn't speak for a long time. A doctor came out around 2 in the morning. He was older, maybe 60, with a wide forehead and reading glasses pushed up on top of his head. He introduced himself as Dr. Marlowe and told us my daughter had sustained a serious head injury and 2 fractured ribs, but that she was out of immediate danger and resting in recovery. He said she was unconscious but stable, and that we could see her in a few hours when she'd been moved to a room. My son-in-law asked questions. What was the recovery timeline? When could she come home? Would there be lasting effects? He asked them calmly and in a reasonable order, the way you might ask questions about a renovation project that had gone slightly sideways. I watched Dr. Marlowe while my son-in-law spoke. The doctor answered everything directly, but there was something in his posture, a small, careful tension, the kind that comes from someone who is deciding something while also appearing not to decide anything. "Mr. Calloway," he said, looking at me, "could I have a brief word with you? Just some background on Claire's medical history that might help us with her care going forward." My son-in-law said he could answer those questions. He said he was Claire's husband and that he knew her medical history completely. Dr. Marlowe looked at him with a neutrality that was almost its own form of answer. "I appreciate that. I'd like to speak with her father for just a moment. It won't take long." We walked down a corridor that seemed to get quieter with each step. Dr. Marlowe opened the door to a small consultation room and gestured me inside. He closed the door behind him and did not sit down. He stood near the window with his arms at his sides, and his face arranged into something very serious. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need an honest answer," he said. I told him to go ahead. "Has your daughter ever mentioned feeling unsafe at home?" The question hit me in a place I wasn't prepared for. I said I didn't know. I said she'd seemed tired lately, a little withdrawn. I said she'd stopped coming to Sunday dinners as often. Dr. Marlowe nodded slowly. He reached into the inside pocket of his white coat and pulled out a plain brown envelope. It was sealed. He held it toward me with a steadiness that told me he'd thought about this moment for a while before it happened. "This contains copies of documentation I've pulled together over the past several weeks," he said quietly. "Prescription records, dosage histories, lab work from Claire's previous hospital visits. I need you to understand something. I am stepping well outside what I'm supposed to do right now. I could lose my license for handing you this. But Claire has been in this hospital 3 times in the past 7 months, and this fall tonight makes 4, and I cannot look the other way any longer." I took the envelope. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me. "Is my daughter in danger?" "She has been in danger," he said. "I believe tonight was not an accident." He paused. "Your son-in-law took out a life insurance policy on your daughter 14 months ago. I only know this because a colleague in our administrative department flagged an unusual inquiry about hospital billing that led to some of our staff reviewing her file. The policy is substantial. I don't know how much, but substantial." I asked him what was in the prescription records. Anti-anxiety medication prescribed at 1 dose by her family physician. But her blood work on all 4 visits shows significantly higher levels than that dosage would produce. Someone has been supplementing what she's been taking, possibly adding to her food or her drinks. The higher dosages over time cause dizziness, confusion, impaired coordination. They cause people to fall. I stood there in that small room and felt the floor tilt beneath me. "Where are my grandchildren right now?" I asked. "At home, I would assume." "With who?" Dr. Marlowe shook his head. He didn't know. He told me again to be careful with the envelope, to open it somewhere private, to not let my son-in-law see it. He told me to take my grandchildren and go somewhere my son-in-law wouldn't know to look. He said he'd already spoken to a lawyer friend and that the police would need to be involved, but that he wanted the children safe first. He left the room before I did. I stood there alone for a moment with the envelope in my hands, and 7 months of Sunday dinners my daughter hadn't come to suddenly making a different kind of sense. I walked back to the waiting room and sat down. My son-in-law was on his phone. I told him I needed to use the washroom and walked down the hall, found the family washroom at the end, locked the door behind me, and opened the envelope standing at the sink. The first page was a table of lab results. Claire's name, 4 dates over 7 months. A column marked benzodiazepine serum level with values that increased each visit, none of them matching a therapeutic dose. There was a printed note from Dr. Marlowe in his handwriting, precise and small. Prescribed dose at 0, 5 milligrams daily. Serum levels consistent with 3-4 milligrams daily on all 4 presentations. Source of additional medication not identified. The second document was a list of prescriptions filled under my son-in-law's name at 4 different pharmacies in 3 different cities. Barry, Aurelia, Midland, the same medication, refilled repeatedly over 18 months, quantities that far exceeded any legitimate personal use. The third page was a printout from a legal services inquiry, clearly photocopied from a screen. It showed an insurance policy number, a policyholder name my daughter's, and an annual premium. At the bottom, handwritten in the margin, policy value confirmed by admin contact, $2, 3M, issued 14 months ago. I sat down on the lid of the toilet because my legs weren't reliable anymore. I read the rest of the documents with my elbows on my knees. There were pharmacy intake forms with forged signatures that I recognized were not my daughter's handwriting. There was a note from Dr. Marlowe explaining that her regular family physician, a GP in Innisfil who'd been seeing Claire for 6 years, had called Street Joseph's the month before to express concern about discrepancies in her medication refill history. Someone had been calling the pharmacy using her file number and requesting refills she hadn't authorized. I put everything back in the envelope and stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked old. I looked frightened. I looked like a man who had spent 31 years teaching other people's children how to navigate the world and had somehow failed to protect his own. I put the envelope inside my coat. I needed to know where Sophie and Ben were. I walked back to the waiting room. My son-in-law looked up from his phone when I sat down. I told him I was going to try to get a few hours of rest and asked whether the kids were home. He said his brother was watching them. He said he'd called his brother right away and that they were both asleep, that they didn't need to be disturbed. I asked him his brother's name. He told me it was Gary, that he lived in Angus. I said I'd never met Gary. My son-in-law said Gary mostly kept to himself, that family events weren't really his thing. In 7 years, I had never once heard my son-in-law mention a brother named Gary. I went to the hallway and called my sister in Nova Scotia. It was almost 3 in the morning. She answered on the second ring because that is the kind of person my sister has always been. I told her I needed her to drive. I told her I knew how far it was, and I knew what the highways were like in February, and I didn't care. I told her I needed someone I trusted completely, and that I needed them here. She asked me what was happening. I said I would explain everything, but I needed her to come first. She said she'd be there by noon. I went back to the waiting room and sat with my son-in-law until 5 in the morning, when a nurse came to tell us Claire had been moved to a room on the 3rd floor, and we could see her. She was pale and small against the hospital pillow, her head wrapped, both eyes closed. My son-in-law sat beside the bed and held her hand. I stood at the foot and watched him do it, and thought about the prescriptions filled in 3 different cities. At 7 o'clock, I told my son-in-law I was going to drive to the house and check on the children. He looked at me. Something passed through his expression, not quite alarm, not quite suspicion. Something between those things that came and went quickly. He said Gary had it covered, that the kids were fine. I said I wanted to see them myself. He said there was no need to make the drive. I said I was making it anyway. He held my eyes for a moment, then looked away. Claire's keys are in my jacket pocket, he said. In case Gary doesn't answer right away. He's not great about the door. He handed me the keys without looking up. Tell the kids their mom's going to be okay. The house was 40 minutes south, a 2-story brick colonial on a crescent, off a secondary road outside Innisfil. My daughter had been so proud of it when they'd bought it, had taken me on a full tour the first weekend they moved in, showing me the garden she was going to plant and the kitchen she was going to renovate. I hadn't been inside in 4 months. I parked in the driveway and sat in my truck for a moment. There was a car I didn't recognize at the curb, a gray Honda Civic with Simcoe County plates. I made a note of the plate number in my phone. I knocked on the front door. Nothing. I knocked again. After a long pause, the door opened, and a man in his 30s looked out at me. Average height, a jaw that needed shaving, eyes that assessed me with a quick professional blankness that I did not like. I told him I was Claire's father. I said I'd come to check on the children. He said they were fine, that they were sleeping, that they didn't need to be woken up. His voice was flat, and he kept his body in the doorframe, not stepping aside. I showed him the house keys. There was a pause. Then he stepped back. I went upstairs. My grandchildren were in Sophie's room, both of them awake, sitting on the bed watching something on a tablet with the volume very low. Sophie looked up when I pushed the door open, and I saw relief move across her face in a way that no 9-year-old should have to feel. "Grandpa," she said. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled them both close. Ben pressed his face into my shoulder. I asked them if they were okay. Sophie said they were okay, but that the man downstairs had told them to stay in the room and not come down for anything. She said he'd been there since about 1 in the morning. She said she didn't know who he was. I told them to put their shoes on. Sophie asked about her mother. I told her their mother was at the hospital with the doctors taking very good care of her, and that they were going to come with me for a few days. I told them to put their backpacks on the bed, and each put in the things that mattered most to them. I kept my voice very calm. While they packed, I went to the master bedroom. I opened my daughter's nightstand drawer, looking for her health card and identification documents. I found the health card. I found her passport. I found a small notebook underneath her handwriting. Black pen. Entries that went back almost a year. I read 4 pages standing there. Dropped my coffee mug again this morning. My hands were shaking so badly. Trevor says I need to drink less coffee, that I'm too anxious. Maybe he's right. Fell asleep at the kitchen table again after dinner. Trevor says I've been doing that a lot. I don't remember doing it before. I told Trevor I want to see Dr. Hazel again, but he says she's not the right doctor for what I'm dealing with, that the medication she prescribed isn't strong enough and he knows someone better. I don't know. I just feel so foggy all the time. Sophie asked me today why I'm always tired. I didn't know what to tell her. I'm starting to wonder if something is really wrong with me. I put the notebook in my coat pocket with the envelope. When I came back to Sophie's room, they were ready, backpacks on, standing by the door. Ben was holding a stuffed moose he'd had since he was 3. I took them downstairs. The man in the kitchen looked at us, and I looked back at him, and I said, "I'm taking the children with me. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to call your brother." He didn't stop us. I put the kids in the truck and backed out of the driveway. My sister had texted from somewhere outside Sudbury. I told her to meet me at the Tim Hortons on Dunlop in Barrie. I drove north with Sophie and Ben in the back seat. Ben fell asleep within 20 minutes. Sophie stayed awake and watched the trees going past and didn't ask me any questions that I couldn't answer. She was a quiet child. Had always been a quiet child, the kind of quiet that absorbs more than it lets out. I was grateful for that right then. My sister was already at a corner table when we arrived, a large coffee in each hand. She took one look at my face and set down both cups and didn't ask any questions she didn't need to yet. She took Sophie and Ben to order hot chocolates and let me sit alone for 10 minutes. I read the documents again, all of them. When my sister came back, I handed her the envelope. She read without speaking, her coffee cooling in front of her. Sophie and Ben were at a table by the window, Sophie helping Ben with the wooden puzzle that lived permanently in her backpack. My sister got to the last page, refolded everything, and put it back in the envelope. "Trevor did this," she said. "I believe so. Have you called the police?" "Not yet." "David," she said. "I know." I picked up my coffee. "I needed the children first." She nodded. She understood that. I called 911 from the parking lot while my sister sat with the kids. The dispatcher transferred me to a non-emergency line, and then to a constable, who transferred me to a detective, and by the time I was talking to someone who could actually receive what I was saying, an hour had passed. Her name was Detective Karen Willett, and she was with the Ontario Provincial Police Detachment in Barrie, and she listened without interrupting, while I told her everything from the midnight phone call to the notebook to the man with the flat eyes sitting in my daughter's kitchen. She told me to stay where I was. She said she'd send someone. 2 officers arrived at 45 minutes. They sat with me at a table in the back, while my sister took Sophie and Ben to look at the display of travel mugs by the front door. I gave them the envelope and the notebook. One officer, young, wrote everything down with a careful hand. The other, older, read the documents the way Dr. Marlowe must have read them slowly, coming to conclusions behind still eyes. "The insurance policy," the older one said. $2.3 million. That's what the documents show. "And you've had no prior concerns about your son-in-law? Nothing before the last 7 months?" I thought about that. I thought about the Trevor I'd met 6 years before Claire married him. Pleasant, funny, competent, in a way that always read as slightly performed. I thought about how he'd always answered questions that had been directed at my daughter. I thought about how the calls from Claire had gradually become less frequent and always shorter, how she'd started saying things like, "Trevor thinks," and "Trevor says," in a way that didn't sound like agreement so much as instruction. "I thought I was just being a difficult father-in-law," I said. The older officer looked at me. He had the kind of face that had seen enough of the world not to be surprised by it. "You're not wrong to have had concerns," he said. "Even if you couldn't name what they were." They told me they'd bring Trevor in for questioning. They said they'd station an officer at the hospital. They told me to take the children somewhere they'd be safe, somewhere out of the area if I could manage it, and to avoid any contact with my son-in-law. My sister had a friend in Bracebridge with an empty cottage. That's where we went. Trevor was brought in for questioning that afternoon. He asked for a lawyer within the first 5 minutes and didn't say another word after that. Detective Willett called me that evening to tell me that a warrant had been obtained to search the house and his truck. She said they'd found 2 more bottles of the medication, one hidden in a gym bag in the garage, and one in a locked box in his home office. She said they'd found the original insurance policy documents and discovered a second policy I hadn't known about, one he'd tried to take out 8 months earlier that the insurance company had declined. She said she didn't know yet whether Gary, the man at the house, was formally connected or just a favor, but that they'd spoken to him. Then she told me the other part. Trevor had been married before, not to my daughter before. 7 years before he'd met Claire. His first wife had died in a boating accident on Georgian Bay. It had been ruled accidental. She had drowned. Her family had always believed someone had been with her on the water that day. Her sister had made a statement at the time that the investigating officer had noted but not pursued. The insurance payout from that marriage had been just over $1 million. I sat in the cottage while my grandchildren slept in the next room and the ice creaked on the lake outside, and I thought about my daughter in her hospital bed and the phone calls that had gotten shorter over the years and the Sunday dinners she'd stopped coming to, and I thought about a woman on Georgian Bay who'd gone out on the water and not come back, and I understood that some people walk through the world looking exactly like the people around them and are something else entirely underneath. I drove to the hospital the next morning without calling ahead. Claire was awake. She was propped up against the pillows, her color still wrong, a line of stitches along her hairline. She looked at me when I came in, and her expression was careful in a way that hurt to see. She asked me where the children were. I told her they were safe, that they were with my sister in Bracebridge. She asked me what had happened, why they weren't home. I sat in the chair beside the bed. I told her calmly that I needed to tell her some things, and that I needed her to hear all of them before she responded to any of them. I told her about the phone call from Dr. Marlowe. I told her about the envelope and what was in it. I told her about the prescriptions filled in 3 different cities, and the medication levels in her blood work, and the $2.3 million insurance policy. She was quiet through all of it. Her face went through things I didn't have words for. Then she said, "You've never trusted him." I told her that was true, and that I was sorry for any times that had made things harder for her. She said, "You're telling me all this because you want me to leave him." I said I was telling her because Trevor had been putting medication into something she was eating or drinking every single day, and that her body showed the evidence of it, and that the police had the documentation. She turned toward the window. I watched her breathe. "He's always been so good with Sophie and Ben," she said. It came out quietly, like something she was testing whether she believed. I didn't say anything. "I thought I was losing my mind," she said after a while. "I thought I was developing some kind of neurological problem. I started thinking maybe it ran in the family. Maybe it was something I'd passed on to the children." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. "He used to make me tea at night. He'd bring it upstairs to me while I was reading. He said it was something to help me sleep." She stopped. I reached out and put my hand over hers. She pulled away from me, and I let her. "I want to see the documents," she said. I came back the following afternoon with copies of everything Detective Willett had cleared me to share. My daughter read through them alone while I waited in the family lounge down the hall. It took her 90 minutes. When I came back, she was looking out the window and her eyes were dry, and she had a stillness about her that reminded me of her as a teenager, the way she used to look after something had settled into a final shape in her mind. "He used my notebook against me," she said. "I didn't understand. The entries about forgetting things, losing my balance, feeling confused. He encouraged me to keep a journal. He said it would help me track my symptoms." She looked at her hands. "He was building a record that made me look unstable. In case I ever questioned anything." I hadn't thought of it that way. The weight of how carefully it had been built sat on me. "The woman on Georgian Bay," she said. "Does her family know?" "The police have contacted them. It's under review." She nodded. She didn't say anything else for a while. Then she said, "I want to testify. When this goes to trial, I want to be there." I told her she had time before she had to make that decision. She shook her head. "I've already made it. Trevor was formally charged that week. Attempted murder, administering a noxious substance, fraud, possession of property obtained by crime." His lawyer argued the evidence was circumstantial, and that the medication found in the house could have innocent explanations. Dr. Marlowe gave a statement to the police that was thorough and clinical, and left no room for alternate interpretations. The pharmacy records, once subpoenaed through proper channels, confirmed the pattern across 18 months. Detective Willett called me on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after Claire was discharged. "The Georgian Bay case," she said. "The Crown is reviewing it. The sister's original statement, combined with what we've found here, is creating a pattern the prosecutor thinks is prosecutable. It's going to take time, but the family is going to get answers." I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the frozen bay and thought about a woman I'd never met who had gone out on the water one afternoon and trusted the wrong person. And I thought about how Trevor had walked away from that and looked for someone else and started again. And I thought about how many years he had been practicing whatever it was he practiced. Claire came home to a new apartment in Innisfil, a ground floor unit in a building with good lighting and a super she'd already spoken to. It was modest and clean and entirely hers. She spent 3 weeks painting the living room, a shade of green she'd wanted since she was 22. Sophie helped her move furniture. Ben supervised from the couch. I drove up on a Saturday in April. The trees were starting to show the first suggestion of color and the roads were finally clear. When I walked in, the apartment smelled like fresh paint and something roasting in the oven, and Sophie was at the table doing homework with music playing quietly on a Bluetooth speaker. My daughter came out of the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel. She looked different than she had even 6 weeks before. It was hard to name exactly. Her eyes were cleaner somehow, like something that had been sitting in front of them had finally been moved. She asked me to stay for dinner. I did. After the kids were in bed, she poured 2 cups of tea, and we sat at the kitchen table the way we used to sit when she was in high school, the house quiet and the night pressing up against the windows. She asked me when I'd first known something was wrong, not with Trevor in the hospital before. Before all of it. I thought about it honestly. I said there had been a dinner, maybe 3 years ago, where I'd asked her about the book club she used to go to on Thursday nights. She'd said she'd stopped going. She'd said Trevor found it difficult when she was out in the evenings, that it was easier to just be home. And I'd thought, that's a shame, and said something mild, and let it pass. I'd told myself it was their life and their arrangement, and it wasn't my place. I should have asked more questions, I said. She shook her head. You were respecting my choices. I was taking the easy road. Dad, she said. He was very good at making things look like choices. We sat with that for a while. She said she'd started going to a support group, women who'd been through versions of the same thing. She said the common thread was the fog, the way every woman described feeling like she was living inside, something that was making it harder to think clearly, and always being told by the person causing it that the fog was her own fault. There was one woman, my daughter said, whose husband had been putting something in her morning vitamins for almost 2 years. She thought she had early-onset dementia. Her entire family was preparing for a diagnosis. And she said the worst part wasn't what he'd done to her body. The worst part was that she'd started to believe she was the problem. She'd started to apologize to him for being difficult. I looked at my daughter. I did that too, she said. I used to apologize to Trevor for being clumsy, for falling asleep at dinner, for forgetting things. She put her hand flat on the table. I don't apologize for those things anymore. The trial took place in September. The courthouse in Barrie was not what I'd imagined. Quieter, more ordinary, the way important things often are. Trevor sat at the defense table in a navy suit with his hair combed and his face arranged into an expression of patient wrong dignity that I suspected he'd practiced. His lawyer was competent and relentless, and managed to delay proceedings twice with procedural arguments that bought nothing except time. Dr. Marlowe took the stand on the 3rd day. He spoke for just over 2 hours. He was precise and calm and answered every challenge from the defense with the same quiet certainty he'd shown me in that consultation room at 2 a.m. in February. The jury watched him the way people watch someone whose credibility they've already decided to accept. My daughter testified on day 7. She walked to the stand carefully. She was still in physiotherapy for her shoulder, still dealing with some intermittent balance issues the doctors said should resolve over time. She sat down and straightened herself and looked at the gallery for a moment, then at the jury. She spoke for 3 hours. She talked about the night tea, about the vitamins Trevor had switched out, the ones she'd found in his gym bag when she'd been looking for an old receipt 2 years earlier and he'd explained away without pausing, about the Sunday she'd stood at the top of the stairs and her vision had grayed out, and she'd caught the railing just in time and Trevor had appeared from nowhere at the bottom, looking up at her, and she'd thought even then that there was something wrong with the expression on his face, but she hadn't let herself go further with it. I had a small notebook, she said to the jury. I kept it because I thought I was losing my mind, and I wanted to document my symptoms in case I needed to show a doctor. I thought if I could show someone a record of what I was experiencing, someone would be able to help me. She paused. He encouraged me to keep that notebook. He reminded me to write in it. He told me it was a good way to stay on top of my health. She looked at the jury. He was building evidence to make me look unstable. I was keeping the record he needed to have in case I ever stopped trusting him. He was that careful. The courtroom was very quiet. I don't say any of this to ask for sympathy, my daughter said. I say it because I spent 18 months not trusting my own body, not trusting my own memory, not trusting my own mind, because a person I trusted was making sure I wouldn't. If that's useful to someone, if someone on that jury or somewhere beyond it recognizes what I'm describing, then it's worth saying. The jury took 4 days. Trevor was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 22 years without eligibility for parole. When they let him out, he didn't look at my daughter. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor in front of him, expressionless, with the same performance of calm he'd maintained throughout, right up until there was no audience left for it to matter. The Georgian Bay case was set for preliminary hearings the following spring. The first wife's sister had driven down from Owen Sound for the verdict. I met her in the lobby afterward, a woman in her mid-50s with her sister's eyes, and we stood together for a moment without finding the right words, and eventually just nodded at each other in the way people nod when the words are too large. 6 months after sentencing, I drove to Innisfil on a Sunday in March. The day was that particular Canadian March day where winter hasn't finished but something warmer has started to push through it. The snow retreating from the edges of driveways, the sky almost believing it could be blue again. My daughter was in the kitchen when I arrived. Ben was on the floor drawing dinosaurs with tremendous enthusiasm and no technical accuracy. Sophie was at the table working on something for school, headphones around her neck. It was loud in the easy way that houses with children are loud, a kind of noise that has no concern for itself. My daughter handed me a coffee and we stood at the counter and talked about nothing in particular for a while, about Sophie's hockey season, and the leak under the bathroom sink she'd fixed herself and the seedlings she was starting in the window. She looked healthy, not performing health, actually healthy, her face fuller, her movements easy, her eyes present in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. I got offered something, she said. A victim services organization based in Toronto was looking for an outreach coordinator for Northern Ontario, someone who could speak to community workers, to school counselors, to medical staff in smaller centers about identifying coercive control and medical abuse in relationships. Someone who understood it not abstractly, but specifically. I asked her how she felt about it. Terrified, she said, but the kind of terrified that means it's the right thing. She leaned against the counter. There are so many people who don't know what to look for. I didn't know what to look for. The doctors who saw me 4 times didn't know what to look for except Dr. Marlowe, and we got lucky that it was Dr. Marlowe. She shook her head. I don't want people to need to get that lucky. We had dinner around 5, the 4 of us at a table that was slightly too small for the amount of conversation happening around it. Sophie told a story about something that happened at school, with the exaggerated escalation of a natural storyteller. Ben knocked over his juice and accepted the resulting cleanup with philosophical calm. After dinner, while the kids were doing the dishes with an argument about who was washing and who was drying, my daughter and I sat in the living room with the last of the light coming through the west window. She said, "You could have ignored it." I looked at her. "The envelope," she said. "Dr. Marlowe handed it to you, but you still could have decided it was too complicated, that it was none of your business. That maybe you were just the difficult father-in-law reading too much into things." She watched me. A lot of people would have. I thought about standing in that hospital bathroom with my hands shaking, looking at documents I only half understood, knowing that the reasonable thing to do was set them aside and let the people whose job it was handle it. I thought about how reasonable that option had seemed. I thought about how easy it would have been to walk back to the waiting room and sit down and tell myself someone else would figure it out. "You weren't just protecting me," she said. "You were protecting Sophie and Ben. And that woman on Georgian Bay's family, you were part of what got them answers too." She paused. "You did something that scared you because it needed to be done. That's the whole of it." I didn't say anything. I've never been good at receiving things. "I know we lost years," she said. "I know there were dinners I didn't come to, and phone calls I cut short, and things I said that I'm not proud of. He put a lot of work into making you and me smaller to each other." She looked at me steadily. "But we're not smaller now." Outside, the streetlights came on. Sophie appeared in the doorway to tell us there was ice cream if we wanted it, and her tone made clear she felt this was information we'd been inexcusably slow to seek. Ben appeared behind her, holding 2 spoons with the air of someone who has come prepared. We got up and went to the kitchen. That night, driving home on the 400 with the stars hard and clear over the northern Ontario dark, I thought about Dr. Marlowe handing me that envelope in a small room in a quiet hospital in the middle of a February night, and about the weight of it in my hands, and about all the things that came after. I thought about my daughter's face when she finally told me she wanted to testify, not frightened, not uncertain, just decided. I thought about Sophie asking me, the night we left, whether her mother was going to be okay, and how I'd said yes before I'd known for certain it was true. You learn something at 64 about the things you should have done sooner and the things you did in time. They sit in you differently. The ones you did in time don't settle exactly like peace. They're more complicated than peace, worn through with everything you know about how close they came to not happening. But they're solid. They hold. My phone lit up on the seat beside me. A text from my daughter. A photograph Sophie and Ben on the couch, both asleep. Ben still holding his dinosaur. Sophie's book open face down on her chest. Below it, "They're good. We're good. Drive safe." I looked at that photograph for a long time at a red light outside Barrie. Then I drove home through the dark and the cold, under the kind of sky that only happens in Canada in March, where winter is finally starting to release its grip on things, and the air has the first faint suggestion of something coming back to life.